The car came to a sudden stop in the middle of the street, and the driver behind them blared his horn in anger. Dante Moretti did not move. His eyes were locked on the crosswalk ahead, where a woman pushed a stroller with two small children walking beside her, holding onto its handle with tiny hands. Vivian Hale turned to him, startled, the smile still fading from her lips. "Dante, what's wrong?" she asked. "Why did you stop like that?" He did not answer. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, knuckles pale, his jaw tight. The woman crossing the street had her head down, focused on the children, and she had not seen him yet, but he knew her. He would know her from any distance, in any crowd, after any number of years. Elena Cruz, the woman who had disappeared from his life 5 years ago, without a single word of goodbye. The light changed, and cars around them began to move again. Someone behind them honked once more, longer this time, more impatient. Dante finally eased his foot off the brake and let the car roll forward, slow enough that his eyes could stay on the sidewalk where Elena had reached the other side. The two children beside her, a boy and a girl, looked to be around 4 years old. They had the same dark, curling hair, the same way of tilting their chin up when they looked at something new. He had seen that exact gesture in the mirror his entire life. "Dante." Vivian's voice was sharper now. "You're scaring me. What is going on?" He pulled the car over half a block down, onto a side street, away from the flow of traffic, and sat there with the engine idling. His chest felt tight, like something enormous had been dropped onto it without warning. Just an hour earlier, he had been sitting across from Vivian at a restaurant with candles between them, sliding a ring onto her finger, while her family clapped and her mother cried happy tears. He had felt, for the first time in years, like his life might actually become simple. And now, in the space of one red light, that feeling had been torn out of his chest. "I need to tell you something," he said, though the words felt impossible to organize. "I saw someone back there, someone I used to know." Vivian studied his face carefully. She was not a woman who missed things. She had built her own successful design firm from nothing, and she had learned early in life to read a room, to read a face, to know when something did not add up. "You used to know a lot of people, Dante. That's not usually how you react to seeing them. It's complicated." "Then, uncomplicate it for me." Her voice had gone very still, very calm, the kind of calm that came right before someone stopped being calm at all. Dante looked out the windshield at the empty side street, at the streetlights beginning to flicker on as the evening settled over the city. He thought about lying. It would have been easy. He could have said it was an old business associate, someone connected to a deal gone wrong, someone he owed money to, or who owed him. Vivian knew enough about his world to accept an explanation like that, without asking too many questions. But something in him refused to let the lie form. Maybe it was the twins. Maybe it was the shape of that boy's face, so much like his own baby pictures that his mother still kept in a frame on her mantel. "Her name is Elena," he said finally. "We were together before you. It ended badly, and she left the city without telling me where she was going. I haven't seen her in 5 years. And the children?" He did not answer right away, and that silence told Vivian more than any words could have. "Dante." Her voice cracked slightly on his name. "Are those your children?" "I don't know," he admitted, and it was the most honest thing he had said all night. "I don't know anything right now, except that I need to find out." Vivian sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead at nothing. The ring on her finger caught the passing headlights and threw small flashes of light across the dashboard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, indifferent, full of people living lives that had not just cracked open on a random street corner. "Take me home," she finally said, her voice flat and controlled in a way that frightened him more than if she had screamed. "Please, just take me home." He did not argue. He drove her back to her apartment in silence, the radio off, the only sound the occasional hum of tires over uneven pavement. When they arrived, she got out without looking at him, without a good night, without anything at all. He watched her disappear through the glass doors of her building, and he sat there afterward for several minutes, his hands still on the wheel, trying to decide what kind of man he was about to become. Then he turned the car around and drove back toward the crosswalk where he had seen Elena. She was long gone by the time he reached that corner, of course. He had not expected her to still be standing there. But he was not a man who let a trail go cold. He called Marco, the man who had worked at his side for over a decade, who had never once asked a question he wasn't supposed to ask. "I need you to find someone," Dante said when Marco picked up. "A woman named Elena Cruz. She might be using a different name now. She has 2 children, twins, boy and girl, about 4 years old. I saw her tonight near 5th and Callahan." "On it," Marco said, and did not ask why, because in 10 years he had learned that Dante's reasons were his own until he chose to share them. It took less than 2 hours. Marco called back with an address, a small apartment building in a modest part of the city, nothing like the neighborhoods Dante usually moved through. Elena had built a quiet, careful life, far from anything that might connect her back to him. Dante thanked Marco, ended the call, and drove there alone, without his usual driver, without the 2 men who normally shadowed him through the city. Whatever this was, it needed to happen without an audience. He stood outside the building for a long time before he worked up the will to go in. The lobby was small and plain, smelling faintly of laundry detergent and old carpet. He climbed 2 flights of stairs because he did not trust himself to stand still in an elevator with his thoughts racing the way they were. When he reached apartment 14, he stood outside the door and listened. He could hear the faint sound of a television through the wall, a child's voice asking a question, another voice answering gently. His hand hovered over the door before he finally knocked. The voice on the other side went quiet. Footsteps approached, slow and hesitant. The door opened only a few inches, held by a chain, and Elena's face appeared in the gap. For 1 second, before recognition hit her, she looked simply curious, the way anyone looks at an unexpected knock at their door. Then her expression changed entirely. Her eyes widened. Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. Dante. His name came out of her like a breath she had been holding for 5 years. "Elena." He kept his voice as calm as he could manage, though his heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. "I need to talk to you." "You shouldn't be here." She glanced past him down the hallway, checking, the way a person checks who has spent years being careful. "How did you even find me?" "That doesn't matter right now." "Elena, please, just open the door." For a moment he thought she would refuse. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something, some sign of danger or anger, and he tried to hold himself still enough that she could see there was none. Finally, with a long, shaking breath, she unhooked the chain and let the door swing open. The apartment behind her was small but warm, filled with the soft clutter of a home built around children. Crayon drawings were taped to the refrigerator. 2 small pairs of shoes sat by the door, lined up neatly. And there, sitting on a rug in the living room, surrounded by wooden blocks, were the boy and girl he had seen on the crosswalk. They looked up at him with open curiosity, the way small children look at any new face, without fear, without history. Matteo, Sofia. Elena said their names softly, and something in Dante's chest broke open at the sound of them, at how easily they fit in her mouth, how long she must have been saying them without him. "Go finish your blocks, okay? I need to talk to this man for a minute." The children returned to their toys without argument, too young to understand what was unfolding around them. Dante stood in the doorway of that small living room, staring at 2 faces that mirrored his own so closely, it felt impossible that he had not known of their existence until an hour ago. "They're mine," he said. It was not a question. Elena's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded once, slowly. "Yes, Dante, they're yours." He felt the floor tilt beneath him, though he did not move an inch. 5 years. 5 years of birthdays he had not known about, first steps he had not seen, first words he had not heard. 5 years stolen from him by a woman standing 3 feet away, with tears sliding silently down her face. "Why?" he said, and his voice broke on the single word. "Why would you keep this from me? Why would you take them and disappear without a single word?" "Because I was scared," Elena said. "Because of what your life was, what it still is. I couldn't raise them inside that world, Dante. I couldn't watch them grow up surrounded by the kind of danger that followed you every single day. You could have told me. I would have found another way. I would have." "Would you have?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp, cutting through his anger. "Would you really have walked away from everything you built? Because I didn't believe that then. And some part of me still doesn't believe it now. Dante had no answer for that, because he was not entirely sure himself. He looked past her, at the children playing quietly with their blocks, unaware that their entire world had just shifted. He thought of Vivian's face in the car, pale and betrayed, and the ring he had placed on her finger only hours before. He thought of everything he had built over the past 5 years, brick by careful brick, and how none of it had prepared him for a crosswalk and 2 small faces that looked exactly like his own. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, his voice steadying with something that felt like resolve. "Whatever happens next, Elena, I need you to understand that. I am not walking away from them. Not now, not ever." Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, studying him carefully, as if trying to decide whether to believe the promise in his voice. 5 years of running had taught her not to trust easily, not even the father of her children, not even the man she had once loved enough to build a whole future around. "They don't know you," she said quietly. "You understand that, right? To them, you're a stranger standing in our living room." "Then I'll become someone they know," Dante said, "starting tonight, if you'll let me." Elena hesitated, glancing once more at the children, who had abandoned their blocks, and were now simply watching the 2 adults with the quiet attentiveness that small children often have, sensing tension they could not name. She let out a slow breath, the fight seeming to drain out of her shoulders all at once. "You can sit," she said finally. "You can meet them. But Dante, I need you to promise me something first. Anything. Whatever this is, whatever happens between us or doesn't happen, you have to keep them safe. That has always been the only thing that mattered to me. Not you, not me, not what we used to have. Just them." Dante looked at his children, really looked at them, taking in every detail he had missed for 5 long years. "I promise you," he said, and he meant it with every part of himself. "I will keep them safe if it's the last thing I do." He stepped further into the apartment and lowered himself onto the floor beside the rug, folding his tall frame down to their level. Matteo studied him with wide, serious eyes, and Sophia reached out and picked up a wooden block, holding it toward him as if offering a gift. "Thank you," Dante said softly, taking the block from her small hand, as though it were the most precious thing he had ever been given. Behind him, Elena stood in the doorway of her kitchen, watching the scene unfold with an expression caught somewhere between relief and dread, aware that whatever peace she had built for herself and her children over the past 5 years had just come to an end. A new chapter was beginning, one she could not control, one that came with all the danger she had spent 5 years running from. But watching Dante sit on the floor with his son and daughter for the first time, she found she could not bring herself to regret that he had finally found them. Outside, the evening had fully settled into night, and somewhere across the city, Vivian Hale sat alone in her apartment, staring at the ring on her finger, wondering if the life she had just agreed to was the one she actually wanted anymore. She had no way of knowing that in a small apartment across town, the man she loved was discovering an entire family he never knew he had, and that the choices born from that discovery would soon pull all 3 of their lives into a collision none of them could have predicted. Marco was already waiting outside the apartment building when Dante finally stepped out into the cool night air. He did not ask questions, though Dante could see them written plainly across his face. Some part of him wanted to explain everything right there on the sidewalk, but the words felt too large, too new, still raw from the hour he had just spent sitting on a living room floor learning the names of blocks and colors from 2 children who called him nothing at all yet, because they did not know what to call him. "Everything all right, boss?" Marco finally asked, when the silence stretched too long to ignore. "No," Dante said honestly, "but it will be. Pull the car around. I need to go home and think." He did not sleep that night. He sat in the study of his large, quiet house, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating a ring onto the wood of his desk, and he thought about the last 5 years of his life. He thought about the nights he had wondered, briefly and painfully, where Elena had gone and why she had left the way she did. No note, no warning, just an empty apartment and a phone number that no longer worked. He had told himself, eventually, that she had simply been afraid of the life he led, that she had run because staying had become too dangerous for a woman who wanted an ordinary future. He had never once considered that she might have been carrying something of his inside her when she vanished. By morning, he had made a decision. He called Elena before the sun had fully risen, and though her voice was thick with sleep when she answered, she did not sound surprised to hear from him. "I want to see them again," he said. "Today, if that's possible. And Elena, I think we need to talk about a paternity test. Not because I doubt you. I need it to be official. For their protection, and for mine." There was a pause on the line, long enough that he wondered if she had hung up. Then she spoke, quiet and careful. "I understand. I actually expected you to ask. Come by this afternoon. We can talk about it properly, without the children listening." He arrived a few hours later, carrying 2 small stuffed animals he had picked up from a store near his office, feeling almost foolish, walking into the shop, and asking the clerk what 4-year-old children might like. Elena opened the door before he could knock this time, as though she had been watching for his car through the window. The apartment was quiet. The twins were with a neighbor she trusted, giving the 2 of them room to talk without small ears absorbing every word. They sat across from each other at her small kitchen table, and for the first time since the crosswalk, Dante allowed himself to really look at her. 5 years had changed her. She was thinner than he remembered, with faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes that spoke of years spent working long hours and raising 2 children largely alone. But there was also a steadiness in her now that had not been there before, a hard-won strength that he found himself admiring even in the middle of his own quiet anger. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning. I need to understand how this happened, how you managed on your own for 5 years without a single word to me." Elena wrapped her hands around a mug of tea she had not touched and began to speak, slowly at first, then with more urgency, as though the story had been locked inside her for years and was finally being allowed to breathe. She told him about discovering she was pregnant only weeks after their relationship had fallen apart, about sitting alone in a clinic waiting room too frightened to call anyone. She told him about the night, only days before she disappeared, when she had overheard 2 men outside her old apartment building discussing him, discussing threats against the people closest to him, using words that had chilled her to the bone. "I heard them say your name," she said, her voice trembling slightly at the memory. "They said if they ever wanted to hurt you badly enough, they wouldn't come after you directly. They'd come after whoever you loved. I was pregnant, Dante. I was terrified. I didn't know if they knew about me yet, but I couldn't take the chance that they would find out and use it against you. Or worse, hurt me and the babies to send you some kind of message." Dante sat very still, absorbing this, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. He remembered that period of his life clearly, a dangerous stretch of tension with a rival family that had eventually cooled into an uneasy peace. He had never known how close it had come to touching Elena directly. "So you ran," he said. "I ran," she confirmed. "I changed my name for a while. I moved twice in the first 2 years, just to be safe, just to make sure no one could trace me back to you. I worked whatever jobs I could find, sometimes 2 at once, and I raised our children in the quietest, most careful way I knew how. I told myself I was protecting them. I still believe that. But I also know I took something from you that I had no right to take, and I've carried that guilt every single day since." "You should have told me," Dante said, though the anger in his voice had softened into something closer to grief. "I would have found a way to protect all of you. I would have moved mountains, Elena. You didn't have to do this alone." "I know that now," she said. "But back then, I didn't trust that anything could be safe as long as it was connected to you. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but it's the truth." They sat with that truth between them for a long moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and distant traffic outside the window. Finally, Dante reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card with the name and address of a private clinic he trusted completely, one that would keep any results confidential and secure. "I'd like to do the test as soon as possible," he said, "not because I have any real doubt. Looking at them yesterday was enough to convince me, but everything that happens next, everything I need to do to protect them properly, has to be built on something official, something that can't be questioned by anyone." Elena nodded, taking the card from his hand. "I'll bring them in tomorrow morning. I want this done properly too." Before he left that day, Elena hesitated at the door. her hand resting on the frame as though there was something more she needed to say. "Dante, what about your fiancée? I saw the ring on her hand when you two drove past us. I'm not asking to be cruel. I just need to understand what kind of situation I'm bringing my children into." The question landed heavily. Dante had been avoiding thinking directly about Vivian since the moment he had walked into this apartment, though she had never been far from his mind. "Her name is Vivian," he said. "We got engaged last night, only an hour before I saw you both crossing the street. She knows about you now. She knows there might be children involved. I haven't spoken to her since I dropped her off, and I honestly don't know what she's thinking right now." "That's a lot for one night," Elena said quietly. "It is," Dante agreed. "But none of it changes what I need to do here. Matteo and Sofia come first now. Whatever happens with Vivian, whatever happens between us, that part isn't negotiable." He drove away from the apartment that afternoon, with a strange mixture of clarity and chaos churning inside him. The paternity test would only confirm what he already knew in his bones, but it would also make everything real in a way that could not be undone. He needed to call Vivian. He owed her that much. At the very least, some kind of explanation beyond the fragments he had given her in the car the night before. But when he dialed her number that evening, the call went straight to voicemail, and it did the same the next morning, and the morning after that. He learned later, through a mutual friend, that Vivian had turned her phone off entirely, unable to bear the thought of hearing his voice, while she tried to process what her future had suddenly become. She had spent those first days in a fog of disbelief, replaying every detail of their 2-year relationship, searching for signs she might have missed, wondering how a man could hide something so enormous, even if he had not known about it himself until that very night. Vivian was not a woman who wallowed for long, however. By the 3rd day, she had made a decision of her own. She was not going to sit in her apartment waiting for Dante to decide what he wanted. If there was a woman and children connected to him, she intended to see the truth of it with her own eyes, rather than trust a version filtered through his explanations. She remembered the street where he had stopped the car so suddenly, the exact block, the exact direction he had looked. It was not difficult, with a little patience and a little determination, to begin piecing together where that woman might live. She did not go there to cause a scene. She told herself that clearly, repeatedly, as she sat parked half a block from the small apartment building 2 days later, watching the entrance with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for difficult client presentations. She simply needed to see. She needed proof, one way or another, of what she was actually dealing with, because uncertainty was a poison she had never learned to tolerate well. She did not have to wait long. Around midday, the door of the building opened, and Elena stepped out with 2 small children holding her hands, all 3 of them dressed for an outing, laughing at something one of the twins had said. Vivian watched from her car, her chest tightening painfully as she studied the children's faces, searching for, and finding, unmistakably, the shape of Dante's eyes. The exact curve of his smile reflected back at her from 2 small strangers. She sat there long after Elena and the twins had disappeared around the corner, gripping the steering wheel, tears sliding silently down her face despite her best effort to hold them back. Whatever fragile hope she had been clinging to, that this might all be some misunderstanding, some overreaction born from shock, dissolved completely in that moment. The children were real. The life Dante had once had with this woman was real. And now it had returned, undeniable and permanent, standing directly in the middle of the future she had believed was hers. She drove home that afternoon with a plan forming in her mind, one built not from anger alone, but from a fierce and painful clarity. She would not sit quietly and wait to be told what her life was going to look like. She would confront Dante directly, and she would demand the truth, the whole truth, before she decided what she was willing to accept and what she was not. That evening, her phone finally rang, and Dante's name appeared on the screen. She stared at it for 3 full rings before finally answering, her voice steadier than she felt. "We need to talk," she said, before he could speak first. "Tonight, in person. I already know more than you think I do, Dante, so don't bother easing into it." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then his voice came through, low and resigned. "I'll come to you. Give me an hour." Vivian ended the call and set the phone down on her kitchen counter, staring at the ring still glittering on her finger. The same ring that had felt, only days ago, like the beginning of everything she had ever wanted. Now it felt like a question she was no longer certain she knew the answer to. She had built her entire adult life around careful decisions, around never letting circumstances control her without a fight. She was not going to let this be any different, no matter how much it hurt. Across the city, Dante drove toward her apartment with his hands tight on the wheel, aware that whatever happened in the next hour would shape the rest of his life, one way or another. Behind him, in a small apartment with crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, his children slept soundly, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around the family they had only just begun to know. Vivian opened the door before he could knock, as though she had been standing behind it, waiting, counting the minutes since his call. Her eyes were red but dry now, and her posture was rigid, controlled, the look of a woman who had spent the last hour building a wall around herself brick by brick so she would not fall apart the moment he walked through the door. "Come in," she said, stepping aside just enough to let him pass. He walked into the apartment that had, until 3 days ago, felt as familiar to him as his own home. Now it felt strange, charged with a tension that had never existed between them before. Vivian closed the door and turned to face him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I saw them," she said, before he could speak. "Elena, the twins. I went to that building 2 days ago, and I watched them leave for a walk. I didn't confront her. I didn't do anything except sit in my car and look at 2 children who have your exact eyes, Dante. So don't stand there and try to soften this for me." "I already know the shape of it." Dante felt something in him deflate at her words, some small remaining hope that he might have been able to explain things gently, in his own time, in his own way. That option had vanished the moment Vivian decided to see the truth for herself. "I was going to tell you everything tonight," he said. "That's actually why I'm here." "Then tell me." Her voice cracked slightly, the wall showing its first hairline fracture. "Tell me everything, Dante. Don't leave anything out. I deserve that much, at the very least." He told her. He told her about Elena, about the relationship that had ended badly years before he had ever met Vivian, about the threats that had driven Elena away without a word, about walking into that small apartment and discovering he was a father to 2 children he had never known existed. He told her about the paternity test scheduled for that week, about his promise to Elena that he would keep the children safe no matter what else happened. Vivian listened without interrupting, her arms still crossed, her eyes fixed on some point just past his shoulder, as though looking at him directly was more than she could bear. When he finally finished, the silence in the apartment stretched long and heavy between them. "So they're really yours," she said finally. It was not quite a question. "I believe they are," Dante said. "The test will confirm it, but yes. I believe it completely." Vivian nodded slowly, absorbing this, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had lost its sharp edge and settled into something quieter, sadder. "Do you know what the worst part of this is? It's not even that you have children with another woman. People have complicated pasts, Dante. I understood that when I agreed to be with you. The worst part is watching you become someone I don't fully recognize in the space of a few days. You've been distracted, distant, disappearing for hours without explanation. And I kept telling myself I was imagining it, that I was being paranoid, until I saw those children with my own eyes, and realized I wasn't imagining anything at all. I never meant to hurt you," Dante said, and he meant it, though the words felt inadequate against the size of what had happened. "I believe that," Vivian said, "but intention doesn't change the outcome. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, whatever the answer is. Do you still love her, Elena?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than anything else that had been said that night. Dante considered it carefully, because he owed Vivian more than a rushed, comfortable answer. "I don't know what I feel for Elena right now," he said finally. "There's history there, and now there are children, and that creates something complicated that I can't pretend doesn't exist. But I asked you to marry me because of what I feel for you, Vivian. That hasn't changed, even with everything else that's happened. But it might," Vivian said quietly. "That's the problem, Dante. You have an entire family now, one that existed before I ever knew you. And I have to ask myself honestly whether I'm willing to spend the rest of my life sharing you with a history I can't compete with. watching you build a bond with those children that will always come before whatever we have. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's the truth I have to face." Dante had no immediate answer for that, because some part of him knew she was right to ask the question, even if he did not yet know how to answer it fully. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. Vivian was quiet for a long moment, staring at the ring still on her finger, turning it slowly with her thumb. "I want you to end things cleanly with Elena, if there's anything left to end. I want you to be a father to those children, because they deserve that, and so do you, but I need to know that whatever remains between you and her is purely about them, and nothing more. Can you promise me that?" It was a reasonable request, and Dante understood why she was asking it. But standing in that apartment, with the memory of Elena's tears and the weight of 5 stolen years still fresh in his mind, he found he could not answer with the certainty Vivian needed to hear. "I can promise you that my priority is protecting those children," he said carefully. "I can promise you that I have no plan to rebuild what Elena and I once had, but I won't lie to you and pretend I have everything figured out right now, Vivian. Too much has happened in too short a time. I need you to give me a little room to work through it honestly, rather than forcing an answer I'm not ready to give." Vivian's eyes filled with tears again, and this time she did not try to hide them. "That's not the answer I needed, Dante." "I know," he said quietly, "but it's the only honest one I have." She turned away from him, walking toward the window that overlooked the street below, her arms wrapped around herself now instead of crossed defensively. "I think you should go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need time. I need to think about what I actually want, separate from what I thought I wanted 3 days ago." Dante wanted to argue, wanted to close the distance between them, and find some way to fix what felt like it was slipping through his fingers. But he recognized, with a heavy heart, that pushing her further tonight would only make things worse. "I'll give you whatever time you need," he said. "But Vivian, I want you to know that none of what's happened changes how much I care about you. I know that probably doesn't mean much right now, but I need you to hear it anyway." She did not turn around, and after a long moment of silence, Dante let himself out, closing the door softly behind him. He stood in the hallway for several minutes, his hand still resting against the wood, feeling the weight of everything that had shifted in the span of just a few days. Over the following 2 weeks, Dante moved through his days split between 2 very different worlds. In the mornings, he handled the demands of his business, the meetings and negotiations that had always required his full attention, but now felt like distant background noise compared to what waited for him each afternoon. He spent his evenings at Elena's apartment, slowly, carefully, building something with Matteo and Sofia that had not existed before. He learned that Matteo loved dinosaurs with a fierce and specific passion, that Sofia insisted on choosing her own mismatched socks every single morning, that they both still needed the hallway light left on to fall asleep peacefully. Small things, ordinary things. But each one felt like a gift he had been denied for 5 years, and he absorbed them greedily, determined not to miss another moment. The paternity test results arrived on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, though by then, neither Dante nor Elena needed the paper to tell them what they already knew in their hearts. Still, holding the official confirmation in his hands, seeing his own name printed beside the unmistakable proof of his connection to Matteo and Sofia, Dante felt something settle inside him with a finality that surprised him. Whatever complications remained in his life, whatever uncertainty hung over his relationship with Vivian, this much was now unshakable fact, protected by paper and law as well as by blood. Elena watched him read the results in her small kitchen, her own hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee she had barely touched. "Now what?" she asked quietly, once he had set the papers down on the table between them. Dante looked at her for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "Now I make sure nothing ever threatens them again," he said. "Whatever it takes." He had no way of knowing, sitting in that quiet kitchen with the afternoon sun slanting through the window, that the threat Elena had spent 5 years running from had already begun to stir again, drawn by whispers moving through the underworld of the city, rumors of a powerful man's hidden children finally surfacing after years of careful concealment. Somewhere across the city, in rooms far removed from crayon drawings and mismatched socks, men were already beginning to talk, already beginning to calculate what new leverage might be worth to them, and how easily a father's love could be turned into a weapon against him. The call came in at 11 at night, and Marco's voice on the other end carried a tightness Dante had rarely heard in all their years working together. "Boss, you need to hear this." Words moving through the Castellano circle. "They know about the twins. They know where Elena lives. It's not a rumor anymore. It's confirmed, and it's spreading fast." Dante was on his feet before Marco had even finished speaking, already reaching for his keys. How long ago did this start moving? Hard to say for sure. A few days, maybe a week. Someone talked, or someone got careless. Doesn't matter now which one it was. What matters is Victor Castellano isn't the type to sit on information like this. If he sees an opening, he's going to use it. Dante did not wait to hear more. He was in his car within minutes, driving faster than he should have through streets that felt suddenly much darker and much more dangerous than they had the night before. He called Elena as he drove, and when she answered, groggy with sleep, he kept his voice as calm and level as he could manage, though his heart was slamming against his ribs. "Elena, listen to me carefully. I need you to lock every door and window in that apartment right now. Don't ask questions. Just do it. I'm sending 2 of my men over immediately, and I'm on my way myself. There may be people who know about the twins, people who could try to use them to get to me." He heard her breath catch sharply on the other end of the line, the sound of movement, a door being checked, a chain being fastened. "Dante, what's happening? Are they in danger right now, tonight?" "I don't know yet," he admitted, unwilling to lie to her even in the middle of a crisis. "But I'm not taking any chances. Stay near them. Don't open the door for anyone except me or the men I'm sending, and I'll tell you exactly who those men are before they arrive, so you know their faces." He reached the apartment building in record time, taking the stairs 2 at a time, his pulse hammering as he approached the door. 2 of his most trusted men were already stationed in the hallway, having arrived just minutes before him, and their presence sent a small measure of relief through his chest, though it did nothing to fully calm the storm of fear churning inside him. Elena opened the door the moment she saw his face through the peephole, and she looked exactly as frightened as he felt, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, her eyes darting toward the bedroom where the twins were, thankfully, still sleeping soundly, unaware of the danger gathering around them. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice shaking despite her obvious effort to stay composed. Dante explained what Marco had told him, watching the color drain further from her face with every word. When he finished, Elena sank onto the edge of the couch, pressing her hands to her mouth, as though trying to hold back a wave of panic that threatened to overwhelm her. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said, her voice muffled behind her hands. "This is exactly why I ran in the first place, Dante. I thought if I stayed hidden long enough, if I kept us far enough away from your world, they would never be able to touch us. And now, just weeks after you found us, it's already happening." "I'm not going to let anything happen to them," Dante said, kneeling in front of her, taking her trembling hands in his own. "I promise you that, Elena. But we can't stay here anymore. This apartment isn't secure enough, not against people who already know where to find you." Elena looked up at him, torn between the fierce instinct to protect her children and the equally fierce instinct, built over 5 years of careful independence, to resist being pulled fully back into his dangerous orbit. "Where would we even go?" "My estate," Dante said. "It's secured properly, with guards around the perimeter at all times, systems in place that this apartment simply doesn't have. I know it's not what you wanted for them, Elena. I know you spent 5 years trying to keep them as far from that world as possible, but right now, it's the safest place I can offer." She closed her eyes, and for a long moment she said nothing, wrestling visibly with a decision that felt impossible either way. Finally she nodded, slow and reluctant. "All right. For them. Only for them." They moved the twins that same night, wrapping them in blankets while they slept, carrying them down to the waiting cars with as much gentleness as the urgency of the situation allowed. Matteo stirred briefly in Dante's arms, blinking up at him with sleepy confusion, and Dante found himself murmuring soft reassurances he barely remembered learning, promising his son that everything was safe, that his father had him now, and would not let anything happen. Sophia slept through the entire transfer, her small fist curled tightly around a corner of her blanket, trusting completely in the arms that carried her, without ever waking to question why. The threat did not remain distant for long. 3 days after the move to Dante's estate, one of his men spotted an unfamiliar vehicle parked near the old apartment building, watching the entrance with obvious purpose. 2 days after that, a second vehicle was seen circling the block around Elena's former workplace, clearly searching for information about her new location. Dante increased security further, doubling the guards at the estate's perimeter, installing additional cameras along every possible approach, keeping the twins confined to the grounds rather than allowing any outside outings, no matter how much Sophia begged to visit the small park she had loved. The situation reached its breaking point on a gray, overcast afternoon, 10 days after the family had relocated. Elena had insisted, against Dante's better judgment, on taking the twins for a short walk within the estate's private garden, arguing that they could not be kept indoors forever, that some small piece of normal childhood needed to survive even within the walls of a fortress. Dante had reluctantly agreed, positioning 2 additional guards along the garden's edges as a precaution. It was Marco who spotted the breach first, a section of the outer fence line where the usual patrol had been delayed by several critical minutes, a gap created by nothing more than bad timing and an unlucky rotation schedule. By the time the alarm was raised, a man in unfamiliar clothing had already made his way onto the property, moving with purpose toward the garden where Elena stood with the twins, unaware of the danger closing in behind her. Dante was inside the main house when the alert came through, and he moved faster than he had ever moved in his life, cutting across the lawn toward the garden with his heart in his throat, praying he would not be too late. He arrived just as one of his guards intercepted the intruder, only steps from where Elena stood frozen, Matteo and Sophia gripped tightly against her sides, her face white with terror. The confrontation was brief and controlled, the intruder subdued and secured before any harm could come to anyone. But the closeness of it, the sheer proximity of danger to his children, left Dante shaking with a fear more intense than anything he had experienced in years of dangerous work. He gathered Elena and the twins into his arms all at once, pulling them close, feeling their small bodies trembling against him, and in that moment, every remaining doubt about what mattered most in his life burned away completely. "That's enough," he said later that night, once the twins had finally been settled and soothed back to sleep, once Elena had stopped shaking long enough to sit and listen. "I'm not waiting for the next attempt. I'm ending this properly, permanently, so that nothing like today ever happens again." "What does that mean?" Elena asked, her voice still hoarse from the fear of the afternoon. "It means I'm dealing directly with Victor Castellano," Dante said. "Not through intermediaries, not through careful diplomatic distance. I'm going to make it absolutely clear that any move against my children, against you, will end his entire operation without mercy or hesitation. Men like him only understand strength that's willing to act, and today proved that half measures aren't enough anymore." Elena studied his face, seeing something in his expression she had rarely witnessed before, a total and unshakable resolve that left no room for negotiation. "Be careful," she said finally. "Please, whatever else is true between us, I don't want you walking into something that gets you hurt or worse. Not now. Not when they finally have a father." Dante reached out and took her hand, holding it gently despite the hardness still present in his eyes. "I intend to walk out of this the same way I walked in," he said, "as their father, and as someone determined to give them a life free from exactly what happened today." The following days brought a tense, careful campaign, meetings arranged through trusted channels, a display of overwhelming resolve backed by resources Victor Castellano could not easily match without significant cost to himself. Word spread quickly through the underworld of the city that any further move against Dante Moretti's family would be met with total, decisive retaliation, a message delivered with enough clarity and enough demonstrated strength that even Castellano's boldest advisors urged caution. Within 2 weeks, the threat that had shattered the fragile peace of Elena's small apartment had been neutralized entirely, not through violence, but through the simple, undeniable proof that Dante would stop at nothing to protect what was his. Vivian heard about the danger through Marco, who had reluctantly agreed to keep her informed at Dante's request, a small gesture meant to show her that he still valued her enough to include her in the truth of his life, even during their uncertain separation. She listened to the account of the breach in the garden with her hand pressed against her chest, imagining two small children she had only ever seen from a distance. Caught in the middle of danger they were far too young to understand. She found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, praying quietly for their safety that night, setting aside for a moment the complicated tangle of her own feelings about Dante and Elena, and the family that had upended her plans so completely. Whatever she ultimately decided about her future with Dante, she realized, watching the news of a crisis resolved without bloodshed settle over her like a strange kind of relief, she could not bring herself to wish harm on two children who had done nothing except exist. It was in that quiet realization, sitting alone in her apartment with the ring still resting in a small box on her dresser, rather than on her finger, that Vivian began to understand something important about the decision waiting for her. This was never going to be a simple choice between two women competing for one man's heart. It was something far larger and far more complicated than that. A question about the kind of life she was willing to build, and whether she had room in her own future for a family that had already claimed the deepest part of Dante long before she ever met him. 3 weeks passed before Vivian finally called Dante and asked to see him again, not to reconcile, she told herself firmly as she dialed his number, but simply to close a chapter properly, with honesty instead of silence. He agreed immediately, and they met at a quiet cafe far from either of their usual circles, a neutral space where neither of them carried the weight of old memories. "I wanted to see them," Vivian said, once they had settled at a small table by the window. "The children. I know that probably sounds strange, but I keep thinking about them, wondering what they're like, wondering whether the fear I felt those first few days was really about you and Elena, or whether it was actually just about them, about not knowing where I fit anymore." Dante studied her carefully, surprised by the request but not entirely unprepared for it. "I can arrange that, if you're sure, but Vivian, I need to be honest with you about something first." "Go ahead." These past few weeks, watching Matteo chase butterflies in the garden, hearing Sophia laugh at something silly her brother said, sitting with them every single night to read stories before bed. I've changed, Vivian. Not in some dramatic way, but quietly, underneath everything. I don't know if I'm the same man you fell in love with 2 years ago. I think some part of me has shifted permanently around them, in a way that isn't going to reverse itself. Vivian listened to this with a strange calm settling over her, an emotion she had not expected to feel, but recognized immediately as clarity rather than sadness. "I think I already knew that," she said softly. "I think that's actually part of why I asked to see you today. Not to fight for something back, Dante, but to finally let it go properly, without bitterness." He looked at her, searching her face for any sign that she meant otherwise, but found only a quiet, settled honesty in her expression. "Are you sure? I've thought about this more than you probably realize," Vivian said. "I watched you become someone entirely wrapped around two children I had never even met, and at first, that terrified me, because I thought it meant there was no place left for me. But somewhere along the way, watching from a distance, I realized something important. You never stopped caring about me during any of this. You were honest every step of the way, even when honesty cost you something. That's rare, Dante. I know that now, even if it doesn't change what I need to do." She slid the small velvet box across the table toward him, the ring resting inside it, catching the afternoon light one last time. "I think this belongs back with you," she said. "Not because I'm angry, not anymore, but because I deserve a life where I'm someone's whole world, not part of a much larger picture, built long before I arrived. And you deserve to build that world properly, with the family that's already waiting for you." Dante closed his hand gently around the box, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him, equal parts grief and relief. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for understanding this better than I probably did myself." "Take care of them," Vivian said, rising from her seat with a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the sadness in her eyes. "And Dante, take care of yourself too. You've earned a version of happiness that isn't complicated by secrets." He watched her walk out of the cafe, and though sadness lingered in his chest, he also felt something unmistakably like relief, the quiet settling of a question that had hung unresolved for weeks finally finding its answer. Back at the estate, life had begun to take on a gentler, steadier rhythm. Elena had slowly grown more comfortable within the walls that had once felt like a cage to her, watching the twins flourish in a space where they no longer needed to fear discovery, where mornings began with sunlight streaming through wide windows instead of the cramped hallway of their old apartment. She and Dante had settled into something neither of them had quite expected. Not a rekindled romance built on old promises, but a careful, evolving partnership grounded entirely in honesty and shared purpose. One evening, several weeks after the danger had fully passed, Elena found Dante sitting alone in the garden, watching the twins chase fireflies in the fading light, their laughter carrying across the lawn in bright, unrestrained bursts. She sat down beside him without a word, and for a while they simply watched together in comfortable silence. "I never thought I'd see them this happy," Elena said eventually, her voice thick with quiet emotion. "Not after everything. Not after 5 years of watching them grow up in hiding, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid something might come for us." "Neither did I," Dante admitted. "I spent 5 years not even knowing they existed. Now I can't imagine a single day without them." Elena turned to look at him, something softer in her expression than he had seen in weeks. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not just for keeping them from you, though that will always weigh on me, but for doubting, even after everything, that you could ever put them first the way you have." "I was wrong about that, Dante. Completely wrong. You were protecting them the only way you knew how," Dante said. "I understand that now, even if it took me time to get there. We don't have to keep looking backward, Elena. Not anymore. I think it's time we start figuring out what comes next, together, for their sake." "What does that look like to you?" Elena asked carefully. Dante considered the question, watching Matteo scoop a firefly into his cupped hands, showing it proudly to his sister, before releasing it gently back into the darkening sky. "It looks like them growing up knowing exactly who they are, and exactly how loved they've always been," he said. "It looks like you and me figuring out how to raise them well, whatever shape that partnership eventually takes between us. And it looks like never again letting fear decide what kind of family we're allowed to have." Elena reached over and took his hand, not with the desperate longing of old love reignited, but with the quiet gratitude of two people who had survived something enormous together and come out the other side still standing. "I think I'd like that," she said. "A real chance, built on truth this time instead of secrets." Months later, on a warm afternoon that carried none of the fear or uncertainty of that first startling night, Dante walked hand in hand with Matteo and Sofia toward the very crosswalk where their story had begun, Elena walking beside them, no longer glancing nervously over her shoulder, no longer flinching at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps behind her. The light changed, and they crossed together, an ordinary family doing an ordinary thing, no longer hiding, no longer running, finally safe enough to simply exist in the open, together, exactly as they were always meant to be. Dante paused in the middle of the crosswalk for just a moment, feeling the small hands of his children gripping his own, feeling the quiet, steady presence of Elena beside him, and he found himself thinking back to that first frozen moment when everything had changed, when a single glance out a car window had cracked his entire world open. He had lost so much time, 5 years he could never fully reclaim. But standing there in the afternoon light, surrounded by the family he had once feared he might never truly have, he understood that some things, once found, were worth every difficult step it had taken to get there. The twins ran ahead once they reached the other side, chasing each other in bright, joyful circles, their laughter ringing out across the quiet street. Dante watched them for a long moment, his heart full in a way it had never quite been before, and then he reached for Elena's hand, and together they followed their children into whatever came next.